Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unofficial Seminar. I'm Arup K, Chatterjee, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague Sudip Patra to discuss a very interesting subject of what happens when not only lies but even truth starts showing lots and lots of details. Now, those of you who are admirers and who are avid recallers of the BBC adaptation of Sherlock Holmes will perhaps remember the famous line spoken by Sherlock, that only lies have details. But reality is very messy, and the social sciences, the human sciences, and very often even the natural sciences show up signs of a tremendous complexity in reality. Of course, there are formulae left to us by the scientific greats. Albert Einstein comes to mind immediately. E is equal to mc square. What could be more elegant than that as a formula? But joining me is Dr. Sudip Patra, professor at OP Jindal Global University, and perhaps along with him, we would be able to unravel the many complexities waiting to be cognized out there in reality, which are surely not lies, but even if they are true, they are a truth of a very sophisticated nature. Shudeep, welcome to my show. How have you been?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to for inviting me. And I think that it's quite some time after we are again meeting. Last time we were speaking about philosophical aspects of Albert Einstein, as far as I remember, based on a new book on Einstein, which is this "I'm a Part of Infinity." So I think that this particular topic that you have chosen is also very much in that line, and really reality is something which is not simply in details but also beyond that. So maybe we can pursue that line of thinking further. And going back to Sherlock Holmes, I know that you have done very good research on Sherlock. So I will also be wanting to know that from you itself, that about this particular thinking of Sherlock, because you see that as far as I think that both Sherlock Holmes as well as Sir Isaac Newton, in some sense, the scientific kind of predecessor of Sherlock Holmes, they have been, in a way, very much misrepresented or misunderstood, as far as I think. Because if you know, going back to, say, Isaac Newton has always been thought as to be a very kind of deterministic and very kind of mechanical philosopher, and who was only after details and only after precise mathematical predictions and so on. All of that may be somewhat true, but certainly not true overall. Because even, I was reading a very interesting account by Professor Peter Deer, who is a retired professor at Cornell. And this particular book is very interesting, The World as We Know It, the name of the book is. And there he really tries to give a historical evolution of Newton's ideas. So when Newton first came up with his grand book, Principia Mathematica, and many others, at that time, Newton himself was really not a deterministic and mechanical philosopher. And more importantly, in his own theory, we have, for example, the gravitational formulation of Sir Isaac Newton, the inverse square law, etc. That itself escapes any kind of like a physicalist and mechanical description. So I found that this line by Sherlock Holmes, that not simply details, but something more than details, as you have rightly mentioned, complexity, that can well be the topic of our discussion.
Well, first of all, I was startled when I, read this. So, if I must give our viewers the context of why we are having this discussion, of course, we go back a very, very long way, far longer back than our discussions. We started having these conversations on the history of the philosophy of science last year around the spring, and I think we made 8 or 9 episodes on that. But that was not really the root cause of why we wanted to have this discussion. I was startled because this is very different from the Holmesian paradigm of interpretation, and this is actually Sherlock Holmes in the avatar of Benedict Cumberbatch. It is not Sherlock Holmes in the manner that was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Because I don't believe Sherlock Holmes in the manner that the canon, the Sherlockian canon, wanted to present him as somebody not interested in complexity. On the contrary, Sherlock Holmes, and I'm not interpreting too much, the very canon that Arthur Conan Doyle created has evidence of how Sherlock Holmes was interested in lucid dreaming and Buddhist esotericism. During his exile, he actually goes to Tibet and meets the head Lama. He is at that point in exile, he is incognito. So a person of that, nature, and a person who's reading all sorts of bizarre, outlandish, esoteric things in his lifetime in the 1890s, 1880s, surely would be the last person to gainsay, to dismiss complexity. Therefore, I was startled, and then I understood that this is not our good old Holmes, but the later tellings. Um, at the same time, there is, Shudeep, this problem of Occam's razor. The Occam's razor tells us that when an explanation is becoming too complicated, then surely that must not be the best one. Rather, the simplest explanation is always the better one. But I know this is what I'm going to say is slightly at a parallel, at a tangent to what you had in mind. But take game theory, for example, and that very classic example of two prisoners or two people in custody who are not told what the other person is sharing in confidence with the police or the jailers, is that when two people reveal the least amount of details about each other or whatever mission they were caught at, it's a kind of cooperation. And when they reveal the least amount of details, they may not be caught lying, but they are not exactly telling the truth either. So I think that's a very simple kind of theory to subvert the idea that only truth has details and lies don't have details. Sometimes not sharing the details is also perhaps not sharing the truth. So does anything come to your mind in this regard?
Yes, two directions I will like to go. First of all, let me go into the physics direction. First of all, maybe since we were discussing about this for some time, maybe history of science and philosophy. So you see that you mentioned Occam's razor. Now, certainly, it goes without saying that even today, that is one particular principle which philosophers of science at times get back to. And even going back to Albert Einstein, he famously said that make things as simple as possible, but no simpler, in his own inimitable way. And but again, one must also recognize that when we go into the arena of complexity, as you have rightly mentioned, complexity is not complicacy. That is a very, very important message. So at times we get confused that whether complexity means there is something very complicated. It's not like that. Complexity is an ontological picture, and complexity means that what happens when various processes or various agents, for example, in game theory and so on, they have continuous interactions between them. Say, for example, in a social system, we have so many processes, economic process, political process, and so many things, and they are always interacting with themselves. They are always feedbacking into each other. And that is what makes us a social animal. That is what makes us social systems. In that kind of a scenario, simplicity may not be the right criteria. So this is one thing which has also come up very strongly. So again, by simplicity, I mean this reductionist approach, which is very much there, even in textbook science, even today, that you have a system and you can break them apart and then you can again join them back. So this kind of like a reductionist, atomist approach, you can say, but that really doesn't work when you go into complexity of reality. And therefore, this reductionist simplicity or determinism, in some sense, that is really not the right way to tackle complexity. That is one point I would like to say. And therefore, that give rise to this whole science called as complexity science and complex adaptive systems and so on. Its philosophy is very different from the philosophy of standard deterministic physics of classical old days. That is one point. And the second point you have rightly mentioned about game theory. So game theory is always, one of our favorite discussions. In prisoner's dilemma scenario that you are mentioning, the dilemma is that, say, Alice and Bob both are typically rational. Now, rationality here is something called as common knowledge. Common knowledge means Alice knows that Bob knows that Alice knows dot 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 till infinity that both are rational. Now, first of all, that kind of things rarely happens in reality, but that's a different point. Say even from a mathematical perspective, when there is a common knowledge of rationality, and by rationality we mean something very narrow, something very kind of focused, like just selfish utility optimization. That is what rationality would mean. So, if you start from that kind of a position, the theoretical prediction is that they should always defect. They should not cooperate. They should defect because each and everyone is only thinking about their own selfish utility optimization, and the other guy also knows because of rational common knowledge of rationality, and therefore in the end you end up at a bad equilibrium. That is where you don't cooperate, and that is the dilemma. That how is it possible that even if they are perfectly rational, they ultimately end up not cooperating. Now, this remember that this non-cooperative equilibrium is actually based on a lot of details, isn't it? So it is based on all this kind of common knowledge of rationality and so on, which is ultimate detail. You cannot be more detailed than that. On the other hand, in reality, as you have very rightly mentioned, people do cooperate rather than always defecting. So the question is that why that happens, how that happens. So again, here the paradox is that people may not be that detailed in thinking. People may not have this common knowledge of rationality to start with. But even then, there are other processes maybe happening in the mind or in society that compels people to cooperate. And that is something which escapes our, detailed rational models. So for that, we need to move into complexity and other kind of modeling, if at all we would like to do.
Yeah, I while you were you know talking about scientific models and statistical and probabilistic models, I'm also thinking simultaneously, Shudeep. So today, I think maybe something has happened to me, or maybe the better part of my brain is sort of being overweighed by this other concern of ours. By ours, I mean of citizens in general, of how throughout the globe we are increasingly seeing a kind of the consequence of the kind of messaging that states have indulged in, states and including the intelligentsia has indulged in. So on the one hand, we tended to water down the human sciences, and we tended to create a kind of an apathy towards natural sciences since about 2000, and it began roughly during the Tony Blair administration. It also spread to United States, or maybe it was in US first and then in Britain and Europe. And the consequences are that we have a citizenry, a global citizenry, which was brought up to understand that communication has to be very simple. Communication needs to be easily digestible, easily accessible, very easily comprehensible. But that is not how the complexity of the 21st century can be communicated. And 21st century comes with tremendous complexity, because it is in this era that we are seeing more granularity in the kind of history, in the kind of social sciences, in the kind of perspectives that we have. Today we speak about gender and caste and race without thinking too much, and because that is part of our staple intellectual diet, and it's part of the regular conversations. We were not talking about these themes or these issues 30 or 40 years ago as much as we do today in the developing parts of the economy. Maybe they were parts of the developed economies even back in the 60s, but today they are part of the staple diet globally. and we cannot escape these simple levels of complexity. On top of that, there's more granularity vis-a-vis the economy. Today, we are living in a global economy. We are living in a digital economy. We are living in a public space which is permeated through and through by social media. So, with so many multiple levels of complexity, Shudip, now I don't know. I'm not asking your political opinion here at all, nor am I expressing mine. But what do you sense is this? I mean, what I'm describing, do you think is this in any way consequential to the space of the sciences and scientific communication today? Do you feel like people are receptive to scientific communication today?
Okay, I think that you have really touched upon a lot of very critical issues here. Let me try to go one by one if I can. The first thing is that about scientific communication. You see that there has been a lot of misconception about science in popularity, in popular media and in popular spaces. That is, I think, very detrimental. Because you see that if you go back to various scientific areas like quantum physics and its connection to, say, ancient philosophies and Indian philosophies and all that, there have been a lot of dilution. There have been a lot of diversions there, and that is also one of the reasons that why the credibility on scientific communication has been kind of like going away. And you see that all over the world there is a kind of like popular uprising against the kind of standard scientific thinking. I think that that is dangerous. And but again, at the same time, science itself also has to evolve. That is also another perspective of that. Say, for example, the thing that we are talking about today is complexity science in some sense. And yes, complexity science is again not very well discussed in public space. Complexity science has to be discussed much more in public space. Otherwise, what will happen is that a lot of misconceptions will spread, and in the name of complexity, a lot of miscommunications will be done. And I'm aware of those kind of things happening already.
Yeah,
Say, for example, yeah.
please give some examples of what kinds of miscommunication you have in mind.
Yes, exactly. So that is where I'm going at. Say, for example, from a very practical aspect, one area that we do our teaching also at our university is public policy. We always discuss with our students. So, how is it possible to bring in complexity approach in public policy? Now, one thing is that it cannot be avoided because you have rightly mentioned that in today's world we are living with multi-layered of complexity, multiple layers of complexity. But the problem is that even today, if you think about the communication of public policy to people, that has been very, very kind of like a deterministic and a simplistic kind of an approach. And again, there's a lot of misconception about scientific frameworks in public policy. So, that is one reason that what happens is that people get complexity all the wrong. So people think that complexity means something very complicated and something horribly confusing. So let's not hear about all that. And that is the reason we try to kind of take solace in all kind of wrong thinking and kind of confusing thinking about various science and myths and philosophy are all mixed up. But that is, I think, it's a very important duty on the behalf of academicians like us, as well as policymakers, policy thinkers, to really make this into public debate. That how to think about complexity, how to introduce complexity in, say, policy thinking. So this is one area that we are also working a bit from our research centers, and let's see how it goes. But that becomes very necessary.
Can you give me one example of some aspect of complexity in public policy, or even from the natural sciences, if you want to go that far? But I suppose you'll have examples in public policy itself that can be brought to the public sphere, and that and something that can be brought that can be made a part of the public discourse without simplifying things too much, but at the same time can we make that accessible to the public? How do we start making it legible so that there are certain things at least that the public can begin identifying
Mhm.
so that they don't get alienated. So give me one example if you can.
Yes, say for example, this whole business of economics. You see that
Okay.
economics is something which touches everyone's life, and therefore I think that everyone is interested to understand that where the money goes and how that is going to give a blow to us if there is inflation and various other things, which is happening very much all over the globe. Now, one thing that we can go to the public and for us also, and we try to explain to them in a very simple language that you see that the standard models of inflation and standard models of, say, monetary policy, fiscal policy that you see, they are actually based on a very simplistic assumptions. They are based on very kind of like arcane kind of assumptions. For example, we can see that in the standard monetary policy or standard kind of neoclassical, as we call neoclassical thinking, people are considered as to be fully rational, people are considered as to be isolated from each other, people are considered as to be optimizers all the time. All of these things we can slowly remove. We can say that what happens if you start relaxing each and every assumption. And you see that you don't really have to think it in a very kind of like a theoretical manner. It is something very practical, something very day to day life. So, are we really like that? Or is it the case that we are also motivated by different kind of, as Keynes put it, animal spirits? So, how to really bring in this animal spirits understanding into policy making? If you really don't bring animal spirits understanding into policy making, all the time what we will do is that we ourselves will be making wrong policies, bad policies, and those policies will also misfire or backfire because people are not like that. And therefore, there's a huge literature in policy making that shows that when you have wrong expectations, when you create policies based on wrong expectations, then actually people will always backfire and they will always make it undone. And there's a many examples of that. So these kind of things we can reach out to people in a very simple language, coming from like daily day-to-day life examples. And another very kind of like a practical area which has come up over time in policy making, since you are raising this question, is input from behavioral sciences. Say for example, nudge theory of nudge, etc., which are again based on day-to-day life examples. So these kind of things, I believe, need to be brought into public discourse much more.
So while you were speaking, and because the backdrop to my next question is some of the conversations that we've had off the record. Now we can't, of course, you and I both know that we can't put everything on the record, but Shudip, I want to, try and probe what you feel about this thing in public policy, but many other kinds of public interactions or public discourses, where and I think you were sort of touching on it, that there is a benefactor and there are beneficiaries, or there's a creator of a policy and there are beneficiaries of that policy. And you are saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are saying that we always think of the beneficiaries as rational people, and by rational you don't only mean people who are utilitarian, but rational as in who also have some degree of human compassion, integrity, and other finer qualities that, according to Maslow's pyramid, are acquired only during self-actualization or
Yeah.
close to self-actualization. So, in a sense, I'm where I'm coming from. I'm sort of skeptical. I'm sort of skeptical of looking at the beneficiary as being minus the animal spirit. How do we convey to the beneficiaries, or do you feel like our public discourses are too polite? And polite is not necessarily a good thing here. So, how do we, without sugarcoating the reality, come to people and tell them we have self interest, or you all, including us, we have self interest, and our finer spirits have to be cultivated. But until we do that universally, how do you address these animal spirits? How do you address the fact that people find loopholes after loopholes in all these legal mechanisms? And I know this is not your domain, Shudeep, but ultimately what I'm getting at is isn't this also the domain of complexity? But finally, my question to you really is, how will the states, how will the bureaucracy communicate it to the people without engaging intellectuals like you? And if the states across the globe are so skeptical, in fact, so cynical of intellectuals, if we are de-intellectualizing our societies so much, then we are going to go into endless recessions. So is this making sense to you? Do you see where
Yeah.
that frustration is coming from?
Yes, I fully agree with that. I fully share your frustration too, because you see that it is also on our own part. We really need to come up with more and more public discourse where we need to inculcate critical thinking, and not anything like mouthful that okay, this is critical thinking, but really the spirit of it. That is the most important thing. And I hope that more and more modern universities and modern places which are coming up, they really need to realize this, that we need to inculcate critical thinking for the to really for the spirit of it, not just for the sake of it. And that is the only way, because you see that as little as I understand that public discourse has to be like something like standing in front of the mirror. It cannot be like just patting your back and something like that. Well, that is not going to help us anytime, because that is rather going to give us much more trouble over the time. Therefore, say going back to your question about rationality, I think that which is like a very fundamental question. So, what kind of rationality we really need? So here we can really go to the public and say that well, rationality should not be equated to only say mean-minded utility optimization. That is really not the way how rationality should be understood. And it can also be related very deeply with our civilizational values. Indian civilization for thousands of years, it escapes any kind of like simple, simplistic, rationalistic model. So in that case, rationality is, as you have rightly mentioned, related to compassion, related to ethics, related to various other domains with good, bad, everything. So we need to bring this up more and more to the public and say that well, we also have to change as academia. We have to also introspect our standard mathematical and theoretical models, and that is the main reason that why sciences like complexity science and quantum like frameworks, something that we work in also, these things are on rise. And I really believe that this kind of things should be written in more simple language and more communicated with people.
On a related note, Sudeep, so you and I do not need any certificate for our shared excitement, for our shared enthusiasm, and I think these are very mild forms of expression that we have for the civilizational values. And you've told me, and I've also shared how much criticism that people like us get, because we try to bring back as far as possible the textual values from the scientific and the esoteric texts like the Upanishads, for instance. But both these domains, because of apathy or whatever other political reasons, they tend to get marginalized in the public discourses of the 21st century. That's okay. We live with that. But the bigger issue is we tend to be sometimes, and this happened when you and I started having the philosophy of science conversations as well. Sometimes hastily we tend to get clubbed into that part of the discourse which tries to simplify everything. I mean, to give you an example, Shrudeep, I just heard this somewhere, and it's humorous. I'm not trying to laugh at somebody. I'm sharing this because of its comicality. A spiritual leader was telling a crowd that we in India do not make gods out of human beings. Now, that's a very noble sentiment. The example they gave was the Bhishma Pitamaha was shot 100 arrows, and Bhishma Pitamaha was lying, but we didn't declare him God. But somebody somewhere got 4 nails dug in, and they became a god. So on the one hand, it's good humor. So as stand-up comedy, I think it's perfectly welcome. But it's also part of a spiritual slash a quasi philosophical discourse, and it's having a lot of impact. Now, my grief is completely not because of this one comment. I found it quite humorous. But there's a related specimen of comments on religion, philosophy, quantum mechanics. This Trimurti, this Trinity has been created as if there's a certain religion from ancient times which more or less invented quantum mechanics, and which also invented all the philosophy and deconstruction and difference and all that. Surely there are epistemic roots, and you and I have been trying to unravel those roots. But because of this quote unquote simplicity in communication, everything is becoming everything. And quantum mechanics is equal to Hindu philosophy is equal to Derrida and deconstruction and difference. So have there been challenges of this sort in your in your academic career? As far as the public facing conversations are concerned.
Yes, I think that it is the same thing that we always face all the time. Say, for example, in case of quantum light framework, the area that I work in, more technically it is known as quantum cognition. So these are basically mathematical and philosophical models, and say mainly taking from quantum information theory, trying to understand human cognition, human decision making from a completely new perspective, but then also going beyond. So it is not staying there only. And I am very much sure that once we try to go beyond the standard quantum physics realm, also, there will be interesting epistemic connections, as you have mentioned, with various world philosophies. There is no doubt about that. Say, you know that one of my work that I have been doing with a very senior scientist in India, that has been looking into one particular philosophical aspect of Jain philosophy,
What
Anekantavada.
about that?
So yeah, and
Yeah.
how Anikantavada can be used to create a kind of completely new kind of a logic, which is this multi-valued contextual logic. And multi-valued contextual logic is very related to the quantum foundations, but that doesn't mean that they are equivalent. It simply means that there are interesting insights one can draw from one to the other. And that is, I think, that our we as academicians should also be very clear about that, and we should also communicate that very clearly to public. We will, our larger sphere, that all that we are trying to do is basically draw some interesting insights, and insights should never be equated with equivalences. So there is no equivalence, and rather if we try to make those equivalents, that this means that and that means this, so in that case we are diluting everything. And not only that, we are also creating a lot of confusion. I think that any right-minded scholar will never do this problem, no, never get into this. But yes, it is an unfortunate problem which has happened over time, and it is our duty to dispel this kind of confusion more and more through our writings, through more and more communications. Podcasts like this is very important. Let's see how far we can go, but we must.
Well, that's a brilliant spirit, Sudeep. It's great to have you back on the unofficial seminar. Well, it's virtually your first episode on this avatar of the podcast. But great to be back in conversation with you, Sudeep. I would love to hear from you the new stuff that you've been working on in our next conversation. Hopefully, that will be soon. Dear audience, thank you so much for joining. Sudeep, once again, great insights. But I think things are just warming up. We need to
Yeah,
have
yeah,
many
of
more
course. Yeah,
conversations,
yeah.
and
Sure,
hopefully
sure.
we will pick up the thread from where we left on Einstein, Tagore, and there's so much to discuss. Thank you so much, dear audience. Please like, share, and subscribe to the unofficial seminar. And until next time,